The stars in the dark sky stretched endlessly in every direction. The vastness of space felt both comforting and intimidating to the humans aboard the fleet. The journey had been long, but it was worth it. A new chapter was about to begin for humanity, one that could change the course of history. Captain Jahayan stood on the bridge of the Hanseo, the largest and most powerful ship in the fleet. His hands rested on the console as he gazed out the viewport at the endless black. The hum of the ship's engines was a steady reminder of the journey they had already made. "Captain," a voice called out. It was Lieutenant Minesio, one of Jahayan's most trusted officers. She was at her station, her fingers flying over the controls as she monitored the fleet's progress. "We're receiving a transmission from the Garanth monitoring station. They've detected us," and turned, his face calm, but his mind alert. The Garanth were an advanced alien race, and they had territory near the edge of human space. The fleet had made this journey in the hopes of establishing peace with them, but the mission was risky. The humans had no idea how the Garanth would react to their presence. "Put it through," Jahayan ordered. Minesio nodded and pressed a few buttons. The large screen on the bridge flickered, and an image appeared. It was a Garanth official tall, with sharp features and glowing eyes. His voice echoed across the room, cold and calculating. "You are entering Garanth space. We do not recognize your fleet. Identify yourselves immediately," the official demanded. Jahan stood tall. "We are the human fleet, here on a mission of peace. Our fleet has been misidentified. We come in peace." The Garanth's eyes narrowed. "We have records of your ships, but these do not match anything in our database. Every ship you possess is labeled Dreadnought class. What is the meaning of this?" Jahayan's heart skipped a beat. He had hoped this moment wouldn't come so soon, but the Garanth had already made their conclusions. The Hanseo and the other ships in the fleet were designed for defense, not offense. But to the Garanth, the term Dreadnought could only mean one thing: war. "We are not here to fight," Jahan said, his voice steady but firm. "We have come to establish diplomatic relations. The Dreadnoughts are defensive vessels built for the protection of our people. Please, allow us to prove our intentions." The Garanth official paused, considering the words. "Your ships do not seem like vessels of peace. Dreadnoughts are symbols of destruction. Why should we trust you?" Before Jahayan could respond, Minesio spoke up. "Captain, I'm running a scan of the Garanth fleet's nearby positions. I suggest we prepare for the worst." Jahan turned to her. "You're right. If they believe we are a threat, they might not hesitate to strike first." "I'll work on a diplomatic response," Sujin, the fleet's ambassador, said from behind Jahayan. She had been quietly listening to the exchange. "Perhaps there is a way to prove our intentions without further escalating things." Jahayan nodded. "Do what you can, Sujin. The last thing we need is for this to turn into a war before we've even met face to face." The transmission cut off, leaving the humans to wonder what the Garanth would do next. Tension filled the air on the bridge. They had traveled too far, crossed too many light years, to let misunderstandings stand in their way. "I'll begin preparing the fleet's defenses," Minesio said, her tone grim. "We may not be able to avoid conflict." Jahayan looked out the viewport again, feeling the weight of the moment. The future of humanity was at stake. He knew that the next few hours could determine whether the human race would be welcomed into the galaxy or pushed into a war they were not ready for. "We'll handle this calmly," Jahan said, his voice resolute. "We've trained for moments like this. We won't allow fear to drive our decisions. Let's get ready for the next phase of our mission." As the fleet continued its journey into the unknown, the crew prepared for whatever lay ahead. They had no idea that this first contact with the Garanth would be the beginning of a larger conflict that would shape the future of the galaxy. They only knew one thing: they had to be ready. The next few hours were filled with tension. Captain Jahayan stood at the command console, his mind racing. The fleet was still a long way from the Garanth homeworld, but their encounter had already begun to feel like a game of high stakes. His fingers tapped lightly on the edge of the console as he thought about the Garanth. What if they didn't believe the humans? What if they attacked? The Dreadnought ships, though powerful, were built for defense. If it came to a fight, they could hold their ground, but could they win? Captain Lieutenant Minesio's voice broke through his thoughts. "I'm picking up something on long-range scans." It's another Garanth fleet much larger than expected. They're approaching our position. Jehani turned quickly, his eyes scanning the data Menesio was pulling up. How far are they? 6 hours, Captain, she replied, her voice steady, despite the seriousness of the situation. They're moving fast, too fast for us to avoid them. We'll be within range before we can reach a safe distance. Jehine clenched his jaw, trying to keep calm. Can we communicate with them? Warn them that we are not a threat? Menesio hesitated. I've already sent a message to the Garanth command. They haven't replied. It's possible they won't listen to us. The cold realization sank in. The Garanth had already made up their minds. They saw the human fleet as a threat, and that would be hard to change, especially with their ships already closing in. We need to be ready, Jehine said, his voice tight with determination. Prepare the fleet for defense. Menesio, you're with me. Sujin, start working on a more formal message. We need every chance to avoid a fight. I'll send word to all fleet commanders, Sujin said, standing beside the captain. She was calm, but her face showed the stress of the situation. If we can't make them see reason, we might need to fight back. Jehan nodded grimly. I hope it doesn't come to that. As the hours passed, the tension on the bridge only grew. The Garanth fleet was getting closer. Jehine's mind raced, thinking of every possible way to prevent a war. Peace was the goal. But how could they convince the Garanth? After all, they only saw the human fleet as a large, powerful military force, something that was hard to ignore or misunderstand. In the silence of the bridge, the only sounds were the occasional beeps of the consoles and the quiet hum of the ship's engines. The crew worked diligently, preparing for a situation they hoped they would never have to face. After what felt like an eternity, a new transmission appeared on the screen. It was from the Garanth fleet. The image of a Garanth officer appeared, this time a different face than the one they had spoken to before. His expression was even more serious, his eyes sharp and calculating. Human fleet, the Garanth officer began, his voice cold. You are entering our territory without permission. Your ships have been identified as Dreadnought class. We consider you a threat. Prepare to be neutralized. The words hit like a punch. Jehine's grip tightened on the console. We are not your enemies, he said firmly, trying to keep his voice calm. We came here to open diplomatic relations. We are peaceful people. The officer's eyes narrowed. We will not risk our civilization on your claims. Your ships are a threat to the balance of power. Do not make us act against you. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Jehine exhaled slowly, his heart racing. It's worse than I thought, he muttered. They won't listen. Menesio turned to him, her expression one of resolve. They've already made their decision. If they think we're here to fight, we might not have a choice but to show them otherwise. Jehine nodded grimly. We will defend ourselves, if necessary. But we still try for peace. Turned to Sujin, who had been quietly listening. Ambassador, do you have any other options? Anything we can do to change their minds? Sujin shook her head slowly. We've done everything we can. Our fleet is here for peaceful purposes, but they don't see it that way. I'll continue trying to contact them, but I don't know if they'll listen. Jehine's mind worked quickly. The Garanth were not going to back down easily. They had already shown their hostility, and their fleet was closing in fast. The captain knew they had to prepare for the worst. We'll make our stand here, Jehine said, determination in his voice. But we will continue to offer peace. Prepare the fleet for a defensive stance. If they fire, we respond only to protect ourselves. Understood, Captain, Menesio said, her voice steady. I'll coordinate with the other ships. The tension was unbearable. The crew moved quickly, each person aware of the gravity of the situation. The calmness that had been a part of the fleet was now replaced with the steady pulse of readiness. As the hours passed, the Garanth fleet continued to close in. The human ships powered up their weapons, not with the intention to strike first, but to show they were ready to defend themselves if necessary. Jehane stood at the bridge. Watching the view screen as the Garanth fleet moved closer, he couldn't help but wonder if there was another way to avoid this fight. Was there a chance to convince them of the truth? That humanity was not a threat, but a people seeking to build peace? He turned to Minesio, his thoughts racing. How much longer until they're in range? 2 hours, Captain, she replied. We'll have to make a decision soon. Jahine's mind was in turmoil. The future of the human race could depend on what happened next. If the Garanth didn't see the truth, everything they had worked for could end in disaster. The seconds seemed to stretch into eternity. As the human fleet waited for the Garanth to make their move, on the bridge of the Hanseo, Captain Jahian paced back and forth, his eyes never leaving the view screen. The Garanth ships were still closing in, their movements methodical and calculated. Every second felt like a countdown to something that could change everything. He had hoped for peace, but the Garanth were not making it easy. Minesio was at her station, scanning the incoming fleet. Her fingers danced over the controls, her mind working quickly to process the data. Captain, they're still on course. At this speed, we'll be within range in less than an hour, she said, her voice steady. But Jahian could hear the tension beneath it. Jahian nodded grimly, his gaze locked on the screen. Keep monitoring them. Sujin, what's the status of the diplomatic channels? Sujin stood nearby, her eyes focused on the communications array. I'm still trying to establish a secure line, Captain. But they haven't responded to my last transmission. I think they've already made up their minds. They see us as a threat, and they're preparing for conflict. A heavy silence settled over the bridge. Jahian felt the weight of the situation pressed down on him. It was clear that the Garanth had already decided they would not accept the humans as peaceful visitors. The fact that their ships were all labeled as Dreadnought class had sealed their fate in the eyes of the Garanth. It didn't matter that humanity wasn't here to invade. The name alone was enough to make the Garanth see them as enemies. We need to get through to them, Jahian said, his voice low but determined. We can't just sit here and wait for them to attack. Sujin nodded, stepping forward. I agree, Captain. But if they refuse to listen, we may not have any choice but to defend ourselves. The tension was palpable, the feeling of an inevitable storm on the horizon. Jahian looked at each of his crew members, his trusted officers. He knew that whatever happened next, they would face it together. But the thought of war was a heavy burden. The fleet was prepared, but this was not why they had come to the galaxy. They had come to make allies, to learn, to grow. But now it seemed like those hopes were slipping away. Just then, a new transmission came through. The face of the same Garanth officer from before appeared on the view screen. His eyes glowed with an unsettling intensity as he spoke, his voice cold and harsh. You have failed to understand our position, human fleet. We cannot afford to allow you to proceed further into our space. You will turn around immediately and leave, or we will take action. Jahian's heart sank. The words were clear. There was no room for negotiation. The Garanth had already made their decision. We're not here to fight, Jahian said, his voice firm but calm. Our mission is peaceful. Please let us explain. The Garanth officer's expression didn't change. You are not in a position to make demands. We have already decided. Your ships are a threat to us, and we will neutralize that threat. Before Jahian could respond, the transmission abruptly cut off. The silence that followed was deafening. Jahian stood still for a moment, processing the harsh words. It was clear now peace was no longer an option. The Garanth were going to fight. They had given the humans no choice. Prepare the fleet for combat, Jahian ordered, his voice steady but tinged with regret. Minesio, activate the defense systems. Get every ship ready. We won't be the ones to fire first, but we will defend ourselves. Minesio moved quickly, her hands flying over the console as she activated the fleet's weapons and shields. Defense systems, online. All ships are on standby, Captain. Jahian nodded. He turned to Sujin. Keep trying to reach them, but prepare for the worst. If they fire first, we'll have no choice but to retaliate. Sujin gave a quick nod, her face pale. Understood, Captain. I'll continue trying to make contact. The crew moved swiftly, each person knowing their role. There was no more time for diplomacy. The situation had escalated far beyond what anyone had expected. Now, it was a matter of survival. As the Garanth fleet closed in, the humans waited. Their ships were massive, their weapons powerful. but their goal had always been peace. Now, they stood on the edge of a conflict that could change the course of history. The crew of the Hanseo braced themselves for what was to come. Menesio spoke again, her voice filled with urgency. "Captain, they're within range. They've raised their shields. I'm reading weapon signatures. They're preparing to fire." Jaehyun's heart raced. The time for talk was over. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "All ships, prepare for impact. If they fire, we will return fire in self-defense. No one makes the first move, but we will not be defenseless." The Garanth fleet was now just moments away. Jaehyun could see the ships on the view screens, sleek and powerful, their weapon systems charging. They were ready for battle, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to be a fight unlike anything humanity had faced before. Captain Menesio said, her voice tight. "They've fired." The screen flashed as a powerful beam shot out from the lead Garanth ship. It struck one of the human ships, a smaller vessel, with a blinding flash of light. The ship shook violently as its shields flared brightly under the impact. "Return fire," Jaehyun ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. "All ships engage." The human fleet responded, their weapons lighting up the dark space around them. Bright beams of energy shot out from the Hanseo and the other Dreadnought-class ships, striking back at the Garanth ships. The battle had begun. The sound of explosions echoed through the ship as the Hanseo shook under the force of nearby blasts. Jaehyun gripped the armrest of his chair, his eyes focused on the battle outside. It was no longer just a misunderstanding. It was war. The battle raged in the cold emptiness of space. Bright flashes of energy filled the void as beams of light collided with shields, bursting into a display of colors that danced like fireflies in the dark. The Garanth fleet, vast and powerful, was not holding back. The human fleet, led by the mighty Hanseo, fought back with everything it had, but the difference in size and firepower was undeniable. On the bridge of the Hanseo, Captain Jaehyun gripped the armrest of his chair tightly. His eyes darted from one screen to another as his crew moved quickly, each person doing their part in the chaos of battle. The vibrations from the weapon's fire shook the ship's hull, a constant reminder that they were in the middle of a life-or-death fight. "Captain," Menesio said, her voice calm but urgent, "we've lost 2 smaller ships in the front line. The Garanth are pushing hard." Jaehyun didn't flinch. He had expected casualties. In a fight like this, it was inevitable. "Continue to focus on defense," he said, his voice steady. "Keep the fleet together. We can't let them isolate us." The battle was taking its toll. The human ships, though formidable, were not invincible. They had the power to defend themselves, but the Garanth were relentless, hitting them from all sides. Jaehyun could see from the status reports that some of the ships were already struggling, their shields weakening under the constant barrage. Sujin, who had been working furiously at the communication station, spoke up. "I'm trying again to reach the Garanth command. Maybe if we explain it's too late for that?" Jaehyun interrupted, his voice firm. "They've made up their minds. We need to focus on staying alive, Sujin. We'll talk later if we can." Sujin nodded, though she still didn't give up on trying to communicate. She sent out another desperate transmission, hoping that somehow, against all odds, the Garanth would listen. Another blast rocked the Hanseo, and alarms blared across the bridge. The lights flickered, but the crew remained focused, moving quickly in the chaos. "Shields are at 40%, Captain," Menesio reported. "We can't keep this up much longer." Jaehyun's eyes narrowed. He knew they were running out of time. The human fleet was outnumbered, and their resources were limited. If the Garanth didn't relent, they would be forced to make a decision they all dreaded. "Lieutenant, target their lead ship. Let's take out their command vessel," Jaehyun ordered. Menesio's fingers flew over the console. Target locked. Firing now. The Hanseo's weapons fired, sending a powerful beam toward the Garanth flagship. The shots struck its shields, causing them to flare brightly, but the ship held firm. The Garanth were prepared for the attack. The human fleet wasn't dealing with amateurs. "Captain, we can't keep this up," Menesio said, her voice filled with frustration. "We need to change tactics, or we'll lose more ships." Jae-hyun took a deep breath. He was running out of options. The longer this battle went on, the more the odds stacked against them. But there was one thing they still had hope. He had to believe that peace was possible, even now. Hold the line, Jae-hyun ordered. We can't give up yet. We fight until the last ship, if we have to. But we keep trying to reach them. Sujin, you're with me? I'm going to try to contact the Garanth again. Sujin nodded and quickly moved to Jae-hyun's side. Yes, Captain. I'll prepare a message. We can still. The ship shook again, harder this time. A warning light flashed on the console.
Captain,
Minesio shouted. Another wave of Garanth ships is coming in. They're bringing reinforcements. Jae-hyun's heart sank. Reinforcements. They were already losing ships, and now the Garanth were bringing more. The situation was slipping out of control. Get me a line to their command, Jae-hyun said urgently. Now, Sujin. We don't have much time. Sujin worked quickly, trying to establish a secure communication link with the Garanth fleet. The seconds stretched on as the battle raged around them. The Hanseo's hull groaned under the pressure, but the ship held strong at last. The screen flickered, and a new transmission came through. It was the same Garanth officer from before. His glowing eyes fixed on Jae-hyun with an intensity that made the captain's stomach tighten. You have shown your strength, human fleet, the officer said coldly, but it is too late for peace. You will be destroyed. Jae-hyun's heart beat faster, but he didn't back down. We don't want war. We never did. We came to establish peace, to learn from you. But if you continue to attack us, we will defend ourselves. This won't be a victory for either of us. The officer's eyes flickered for a moment, a brief flash of hesitation, but it was gone as quickly as it came. You will not survive this encounter, he said, his voice final. The transmission cut off abruptly. Jae-hyun clenched his fists, frustration boiling within him. He had tried. He had done everything in his power to avoid this, but now the Garanth were intent on seeing this fight to the end. Prepare for another assault, Jae-hyun said, his voice hard. We will not go down without a fight. We'll give them everything we have. Minesio was already working, her hands moving quickly as she brought up the fleet's weapon systems once more. We're ready, Captain, she said, her voice tight with determination. The human fleet, battered but not broken, braced for another round of battle. Outside the Hanseo, the Garanth fleet loomed, its weapons glowing in the dark. The stars themselves seemed to fade as the two fleets prepared to clash once again. Jae-hyun stood tall, looking out at the battle unfolding before him. He knew the odds were stacked against them, but he wouldn't let his people fall without a fight. The human fleet had come here to build peace. But in the face of aggression, they would stand firm. They would fight for survival, for their future, and for the chance to see tomorrow. Steady, everyone, Jae-hyun said, his voice steady and commanding. We don't give up. No, no. Not ever. The battle had stretched on for what seemed like hours. The silence of space, once a peaceful place, was now filled with the sounds of weapons fire, explosions, and the steady hum of the ships as they fought for survival. The Hanseo and the other ships in the human fleet had taken heavy damage, their shields weakening under the constant onslaught from the Garanth. But they hadn't given up yet. They still fought on, determined to survive and to prove their peaceful intentions. On the bridge of the Hanseo, Captain Jae-hyun stood tall, his eyes scanning the battle unfolding outside the viewport. The Garanth fleet was relentless, their firepower unmatched. Yet the human fleet had held their ground, refusing to back down. Jae-hyun knew the odds were against them, but he refused to give in. Not without a final attempt at peace. Minesio, Jae-hyun said, his voice calm despite the chaos. How are we holding up? Minesio's eyes flicked over the console in front of her, her hands moving quickly to assess the situation. Shields are at 30%, Captain. We've lost 2 more ships, but we're still in the fight. Jae-hyun nodded grimly. Keep the defense systems up. We need to last as long as we can. His eyes turned to Sujin, who had been working tirelessly at the communications station, sending messages to the Garanth in an attempt to reach some kind of understanding. Her face was tired, but her resolve was as strong as ever. Anything from them? Jae-hyun asked. Su-Jin shook her head. frustration evident on her face. "Nothing, Captain. They won't listen. They're determined to see us as enemies." Jaehyun felt a heavy weight in his chest. He had hoped until the very last moment that the Garanth would understand, that they would see the humans for what they were, a peaceful people trying to make their way in the galaxy. Not a force of destruction, but the Garanth had already made their decision. They saw the human fleet as a threat, and no words could change that. Captain Menesio said, her voice tense. "The Garanth are preparing for another attack. They're targeting our command ship." Jaehyun's heart skipped a beat. He knew that if the Hanseo fell, the entire fleet would collapse. The command ship was the heart of the human fleet, and without it, they would be lost. "Activate the final defense protocols," Jaehyun ordered. "We won't let them take us down that easily." The crew worked quickly, activating every last defense they had. The Hanseo's shields flared brightly as the Garanth fired their next volley, striking the human ship with a blast of energy. The ship shuddered, but the shields held. For now, the battle outside raged on. The human fleet fought valiantly, but it was clear they couldn't keep up much longer. The Garanth were relentless, their ships unyielding. And as each minute passed, the chances for peace grew slimmer. But Jaehyun refused to give up. He had come this far, and he would not let his people die without one last attempt at peace. Sujin Jaehyun said, turning to her, "We're not done yet. Try again. One more message. If they're not willing to listen now, we'll have no choice but to fight until the end." Sujin nodded, her eyes tired but determined. She worked quickly, sending another transmission to the Garanth fleet. She had to try. There had to be a way out of this. There had to be. And then, just as the human fleet was preparing for their next move, a strange thing happened. The Garanth transmission came through once more, but this time, the face on the screen was different. The officer who had first spoken to Jaehyun was gone. In his place was a new figure, an older Garanth, with a deep scar running across his face, his eyes dark and tired. The tension in the room grew as the new officer spoke. "Human fleet," the Garanth officer began, his voice deep and gravelly. "I am General Kwanho. I have seen the destruction you have caused, and I have heard your pleas for peace. But the Garanth will not fall to outsiders. We cannot allow you to continue in our space." Wah! Jaehyun felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. This was different. This officer, this general, sounded like he was willing to listen. Maybe they still had a chance. "We do not want war, General Kwanho," Jaehyun said, his voice steady but full of urgency. "We came here to make peace, to learn from you. We are not your enemies. Please, you must understand." The general's eyes flickered briefly, as if he was considering the words carefully. But then he spoke again, his tone unchanged. "You have already broken our trust, human," he said. "The dreadnoughts you bring are symbols of war, not peace. Your fleet is a threat to us, and we cannot allow threats to survive." Jaehyun's heart sank. It was the same story again. The Garanth saw the human ships as weapons of destruction, not tools of defense. There was no convincing them otherwise. Or was there? "We do not wish to destroy," Jaehyun said desperately. "We built these ships to defend ourselves, not to harm others. If you give us a chance, we can prove that we are not the enemy. We are not here to conquer or invade. We only want peace." General Kwanho's expression remained unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, at last, he spoke again. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we have misunderstood you. But the damage has already been done. Too many lives have been lost. Too many ships have been destroyed. The Garanth cannot turn back now." Jaehyun's heart dropped. It was too late. The Garanth were not going to back down. No matter how much he pleaded, no matter how much he tried to explain, it wouldn't change anything now. The general's voice came again. But this time there was a finality to it. "You will surrender now, or we will destroy you," he said coldly. Jaehyun's mind raced. The options were clear, but they were impossible. Surrender would mean the end of everything, the end of the human fleet, the end of their hopes for peace. Fighting back was the only choice they had left. "Prepare for battle," Jehan said quietly, his voice heavy with regret. "If they won't listen, we have no choice. We will fight not because we want to, but because we have to." The battle had stretched on for what seemed like hours. The silence of space, once a peaceful place, was now filled with the sounds of weapons fire, explosions, and the steady hum of the ships as they fought for survival. The Hanseo and the other ships in the human fleet had taken heavy damage, their shields weakening under the constant onslaught from the Garanth. But they hadn't given up yet. They still fought on, determined to survive and to prove their peaceful intentions. On the bridge of the Hanseo, Captain Jehan stood tall, his eyes scanning the battle unfolding outside the viewport. The Garanth fleet was relentless, their firepower unmatched. Yet the human fleet had held their ground, refusing to back down. Jehan knew the odds were against them, but he refused to give in. Not without a final attempt at peace. "Minesio," Jehan said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "How are we holding up?" Minesio's eyes flicked over the console in front of her, her hands moving quickly to assess the situation. "Shields are at 30%, Captain. We've lost 2 more ships, but we're still in the fight." Jehan nodded grimly. "Keep the defense systems up. We need to last as long as we can." His eyes turned to Sujin, who had been working tirelessly at the communications station, sending messages to the Garanth in an attempt to reach some kind of understanding. Her face was tired, but her resolve was as strong as ever. "Anything from them?" Jehan asked.